1756. Europe was at peace in name only. Across the continent, armies were already preparing for another war, diplomats were redrawing alliances, and the settlement that had ended the War of the Austrian Succession was beginning to look less like a peace and more like a pause. At the center of the problem was Silesia. A wealthy and strategically important province of the Habsburg monarchy, Silesia had been seized by Prussia under Frederick II during the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa, the Austrian ruler who had fought to preserve her inheritance, had been forced to accept its loss in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, but Austria had never truly accepted the settlement. For Frederick, Silesia had transformed Prussia. It had given his kingdom greater wealth, population, and influence, but it had also created a powerful enemy determined to reverse his gains. By the middle of the 1750s, Austria was not alone. Russia regarded the growing power of Prussia with increasing suspicion. France, traditionally an enemy of Austria, had its own reasons to oppose the Prussian king. And Britain, whose interests were increasingly tied to protecting Hanover and confronting France overseas, was searching for a reliable continental partner. The old diplomatic order was beginning to collapse. For centuries, Britain and Austria had often found themselves on the same side of European wars. France and Austria had spent generations as bitter rivals. Now that was changing. In January 1756, Britain and Prussia signed the Convention of Westminster. Britain wanted to prevent a foreign army from entering Hanover, the electorate ruled by Britain's king, George II. Frederick wanted to prevent Saxony and other German states from becoming a base for an Austrian or French attack. The agreement was defensive on paper, but diplomatically, it was revolutionary. Britain was moving closer to Prussia, while Austria was turning toward France. In May, France and Austria formalized their new relationship through the First Treaty of Versailles. The alliance that followed was astonishing to contemporaries. Two traditional enemies were now preparing to cooperate against Prussia. Russia was also moving into the anti-Prussian camp. Frederick now faced a dangerous possibility. If Austria attacked from the south, Russia from the east, France from the west, and hostile German states joined them, Prussia could be surrounded by enemies with greater resources. But there was still one uncertainty. Would Saxony remain neutral? The electorate of Saxony, ruled by Augustus III, was strategically positioned between Prussia and Bohemia. Its army was comparatively small, but its territory was valuable, and its political connections with Austria made Frederick suspicious. Whether Saxony actually intended to attack Prussia remains a matter of historical debate. Frederick believed that it might, and he had little intention of waiting to find out. Before the European war had fully exploded, Britain and France were already fighting in their colonies. In North America, clashes over territory in the Ohio Country had begun years earlier. British and French forces had fought through 1754 and 1755, while both sides relied heavily on alliances with native nations. Now, the European powers were formally joining the conflict. Britain declared war on France in May 1756. France followed soon afterward. In the Mediterranean, France moved against British-held Minorca. The French army, under the Duke of Richelieu, besieged Fort St. Philip, while a British fleet under Admiral John Byng sailed from Gibraltar to relieve the garrison. The two fleets met off Minorca on May 20th. The battle did not destroy the British fleet, but Byng ultimately withdrew toward Gibraltar rather than attempting another effort to relieve the fortress. Fort St. Philip surrendered in June. The loss caused an enormous political controversy in Britain. Byng would eventually be court-martialed and executed the following year, becoming one of the most controversial figures of the entire war. But in the summer of 1756, the decisive move was about to come from Berlin. On August 29th, Frederick II crossed into Saxony. The invasion was deliberate. Prussian armies moved into the electorate from multiple directions, while the Saxon army gathered near Pirna, attempting to preserve itself and wait for Austrian assistance. Frederick's objective was not simply to occupy territory. He wanted to destroy the possibility of Saxony becoming a hostile military base, seize its resources, and force Austria and its allies to react before their plans could fully develop. The Prussian advance was rapid. Leipzig fell. Dresden followed. The Saxon court was forced to abandon its capital, while the Saxon army withdrew toward the fortified camp near Pirna. There, roughly 16,000 Saxon soldiers became trapped between the Prussian army and the difficult terrain along the Elbe. Frederick attempted to force their surrender. The Saxons refused. Their position was dangerous, but they had one hope: Austria. An Austrian relief army was being assembled under Maximilian Ulysses Browne, an experienced commander who understood that simply attacking Frederick head-on might not be enough. Instead, Browne needed to distract the Prussian king, threaten his communications, and create an opportunity to rescue the Saxons. This was the first major test of the new war. Frederick moved south into Bohemia. Browne moved to meet him. On October 1, 1756, the two armies collided at Lobositz. The battle began under difficult conditions. Mist concealed much of the Austrian deployment, and Frederick's forces initially struggled to understand what they were facing. The Prussian infantry advanced against Austrian positions, while cavalry fought for control of the battlefield. For much of the day, the fighting remained uncertain. Frederick eventually believed that the Austrian position had been broken. Browne, however, had achieved the essential purpose of his campaign. He had stopped Frederick's advance and prevented the Prussian army from moving deeper into Bohemia. The Austrians withdrew from the immediate battlefield, allowing Frederick to claim a tactical victory. But the strategic picture was far less clear. Both armies had suffered heavy losses, and Browne's army remained intact. More importantly, the Austrian commander continued toward the Elbe in an attempt to reach the Saxon army at Pirna. Lobositz, therefore, became one of the most disputed battles of the opening year. Prussia had held the field. Austria had prevented Frederick from achieving his larger objective, and the Saxons were still trapped. In the end, Browne's relief attempt came too late. The Saxon army at Pirna had endured weeks of blockade and worsening supplies. Their position had become increasingly desperate. Negotiations followed. On October 17th, the Saxon army capitulated. Frederick had won one of his most important objectives of the campaign. Saxony was occupied, its army disarmed, and its resources were placed under Prussian control. But victory came with complications. Frederick ordered the Saxon soldiers to enter Prussian service, attempting to turn a defeated army into a reinforcement for his own. The plan would prove deeply unpopular. Many of the incorporated Saxon soldiers would later desert. Even in 1756, Frederick's success was therefore less complete than it first appeared. The Prussian king had eliminated Saxony as an independent military threat, but he had also transformed a neighboring state into another source of resistance. And beyond Saxony and Bohemia, the war was widening. In North America, British forces had entered 1756 with serious disadvantages.
French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm arrived in New France with reinforcements and took an active role in the campaign around the Great Lakes. In August, French forces captured Fort Oswego, an important British position on Lake Ontario. The victory strengthened the French position in the region and demonstrated that British plans for 1756 were already in trouble. The fighting was not simply a contest between Britain and France. Native nations pursued their own interests, alliances, territorial goals, and security concerns. Some supported the French, others supported the British, and others attempted to remain neutral or shift their position as circumstances changed. At sea, Britain and France were also beginning a struggle that would become increasingly important. Their fleets would determine whether armies could be reinforced, colonies supplied, and overseas possessions defended.
British forces had suffered setbacks overseas, and Russia was preparing to bring its own immense military power into the struggle. No side had achieved a decisive victory. Frederick had struck first because he believed that waiting would leave Prussia surrounded. For the moment, that gamble had worked, but it had also created the very situation he feared. Austria had not been defeated. France had not been removed from the war. Russia was still preparing its armies, and Prussia was now occupying Saxony while facing opponents whose combined resources were far greater than its own. The war had begun with a Prussian invasion. It would continue with an entire coalition preparing to close around Frederick. 1756 had been the year of the first strike. 1757 would be the year when the enemies of Prussia finally began to answer.